Hello and welcome to today's Manhattan Project meeting for Saturday, May 13th. Sorry about this. There have been some problems with our internet connection. I want to welcome you, and we're just going to start our show. We apologize for the delay. Our topic today is how to take back your government. We want to start with a photo. Does this photo actually indicate a future for the United States? We have the photo? Yes, there we have it, although that's not the worst photo. Or do the policies advocated by this dying outlook actually have a future? Well, Helga Zepp-LaRouche earlier this week in sort of talking about the direction of the country supplied a reality check.
Let's move on to the next topic. Helga, the French President Emmanuel Macron, the European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen, and the German Foreign Minister Baerbock have just concluded their visit to China. What do you make of the timing of this recent two visits to France and Germany? What does both sides aim to achieve?
Well, I think the question of European-Chinese relationship right now is extremely important for the reason I mentioned earlier, because, if Europe can be pulled into the camp of the so-called democracies versus the so-called autocracies, it would really be a catastrophe for all of humanity. And fortunately, at this point, President Macron has a very different attitude. He says that Europe must have its strategic independence.
Well, on the one side, naturally, it's very dangerous, but on the other side, it's also a coloss on clay feet. I mean, in a certain sense, whenever you're talking about the British right now, I don't get the picture out of my head of this royal wedding. Actually, if you want to know how outdated this policy is, just look at this ceremony with an unhappy-looking King Charles and an even more unhappy-looking Queen Camilla. I mean, this was a medieval farce. This is, with it goes a denial of reality, because they keep saying that Ukraine will win this war. We just have to send more weapons. I mean, the reality is that the Pentagon leaks made it very clear the poor Ukrainian people are being slaughtered. They are being used up until the last Ukrainian. And the reason why this much discussed Ukrainian spring offensive is not really visible is because you can pump as many weapons into Ukraine, but the fact is there is a demographic reality. Sure, you can send mercenaries, pilots and so forth, but the West is really not that strong. I mean, the underlying weakness is the collapse of the financial system. The U.S. banking crisis is fully going on. The reason why they can't send enough ammunition is because they did too much deindustrialization to even keep a war going. So I mean, it's all. Naturally, it has a lot of human sacrifices and human collateral damage, as they call it, but it is not a winning proposition. So I think that, the sooner more people come and stand up and say this has to stop, the better. The military parade in Moscow, I watched part of it. And, the Western media, again, they say, oh, they didn't show tanks, they didn't show this. But frankly, people better should have looked at the ICBM nuclear-loaded missiles. This is what will ruin the world civilization if we don't get out of this dynamic. So in a certain sense, I find these discussions of Blinken cleverly, in a certain sense, yeah, sure, they re-emphasize the special relationship, the undying brotherhood between the US and Great Britain. But it's not a winning proposition, and it is definitely not the thing which will shape the future in any positive way. So, in a certain sense, it's talk of a past dying empire.
Now, today, Pope Francis is meeting with Zelensky in Rome. We don't have any report, although we may be able to have some report during the course of this show as to what has occurred there. The Vatican's view of the peace process is well known. Their idea is to do whatever can be done to cause an immediate cessation of the military conflict. And of course, for a long time, Pope Francis has been advocating a role that the Vatican might play, inclusive of all nations. Helga Zepp-LaRouche was asked her view of both the peace process, but the role of Europe in particular in the fast evolving world strategic situation.
Let's move on to the next topic. Helga, the French President Emmanuel Macron, the European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen, and the German Foreign Minister Baerbock have just concluded their visit to China. What do you make of the timing of this recent two visits to France and Germany? What does both sides aim to achieve?
Well, I think the question of European-Chinese relationship right now is extremely important for the reason I mentioned earlier, because, if Europe can be pulled into the camp of the so-called democracies versus the so-called autocracies, it would really be a catastrophe for all of humanity. And fortunately, at this point, President Macron has a very different attitude. He says that Europe must have its strategic independence, and a big part of that is that France wants to have a good relationship with China. So this was also, basically when Foreign Minister Xingang went to Paris right now in the aftermath of the Macron visit to China. He met with French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna, and, basically she emphasized the important role of China for ensuring peace and stability around the world. So I think, that is definitely one thing. Unfortunately, the visit of Mrs. Baerbock to China was of a different nature. She was more provocative, and I think she is not a very good diplomat. I actually think, to be totally honest, that she is not in the right space for this position, because her understanding of diplomacy is not diplomatic. She always makes statements which reflect a very poor understanding of diplomacy and the real intentions of China. So naturally, when now Xingang went to Berlin and they met again, they had again, not a very easy time, and profound disagreements came out. So, for example, this whole, what Baerbock is saying is essentially the same thing what von der Leyen is saying. And this has been criticized a lot by German industry leaders who demand a much more reliable and long-term relationship to China. So it's a complicated situation, but I think, even in the German government, you don't have a unified position, because Chancellor Scholz has made very clear that he does want to have more of a stable relationship. Even so, his position has been shaky in the recent period, as was expressed in his speech in the European Parliament, where he said that, the relationship is characterized by partnership, competition, and rivalry. I think this is really a terminology which has been basically coined by the United States and by Great Britain. And I think it would be really important for Europe, for European nations, to define their own interest. I think the question of sovereignty at this point should be upfront, and every country should really think, what is best for them, for their citizens, for the future of coming generation, and think about long term, how do we want the world to look like?
Thanks, Helga. Let's have a short break. We'll be back in a minute.
I am Dan Wang, Chief Economist of Hang Seng Bank, China. The World Today is a real fun program. You will hear interesting people discussing global trend, economic event, what's happening in and outside of China. So, friends around the world, hope you can join us.
Hello everyone, this is Zoon Ahmed Khan, currently based in Tsinghua University. World Today is an excellent initiative to discuss current affairs by including experts from across the globe. I've always enjoyed our thought-provoking discussions and wish the team even more success and impact in the future.
Welcome back to World Today, the panel discussion on Chinese high-level officials' visit to Europe. We're joined by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, founder of the Schiller Institute, a Germany-based political and economic think tank, Chen Weihua, chief of China Daily EU Bureau, Mike Basting, China observer and a senior lecturer at the University of Southampton. Let's continue our discussion. Helga, earlier, sorry for the interruption as we ran out of time for the first half. Could you please continue your opinion on the European strategic autonomy?
Yeah, I said that I think that the fundamental question Europe has to decide, and I don't think Europe as European Union, but more the European nations, what should be the future of, our world? Because either we manage to find a level of the higher one, of the one humanity, or what Xi Jinping always calls the shared future of humanity, or the common future we have. We are sitting in one boat, and either we learn to resolve our conflicts through diplomacy and eventually even by developing friendship among nations and have a peaceful future, or we are risking a big confrontation. And right now, that question is not decided yet. And I think every well-meaning person in the world is called upon to contribute to this discussion. I think we need to have a new global security and development architecture which takes into interest the interest of every single country on the planet. And I think the time of solving problems by war in the times of thermonuclear weapons should be completely out, because if it ever would come to that, nobody would survive. I think Xi Jinping has offered many very valuable proposals: the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, now the Global Civilizational Initiative, and all of these provide potentially a framework to settle conflicts in an amicable way. And I think that needs to be deepened, because, it is one humanity we have.
I want to just emphasize the last portion of what Helga was talking about, and we're going to use for this a statement that she made, which also was the subject of the beginning of our invitation for today's meeting. And here's what she had to say. I think what is required is to really define a completely new paradigm in thinking, to start with the common interest of the one humanity, put the national interests in the context of that, and then find a way of overcoming these supposedly unbridgeable difficulties. As the Pope meets today in Rome with Zelensky, will Nemesis also be in the room? What we mean by that is the principle of a form of justice which seems to come in adversity out of nowhere, but nonetheless is efficient in real history. To discuss what we can do for our country and the world in spite of the Anglophile Coronation crew in the State Department and Biden administration, we have two guests today. We have Harley Schlanger of the LaRouche organization, who's as also often with us on this platform. And there's someone else who's also frequently here, who is Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst and well known to everybody on this platform, an important fighter against crazy wars and insane commanders. So we're going to start today with you, Harley. Sorry for all the technical complications, and hopefully some things will straighten out on my end, but we seem to all be here now, and I'd ask you to take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, Dennis, and good to see you, Ray, and hopefully I'll provoke some interesting comments from you. Look, we're dealing with what Helga said, a very complex, confusing situation, especially if your view is limited to that comes through the mainstream media. But it is very dangerous. And I think the best way to think about it is the way that Helga discussed the strategic conjuncture, which is a battle between the old paradigm and the emergence of a new paradigm. The old paradigm being the neoliberal, neoconservative, neocolonial treatment of the global South, free trade, extract raw materials at low wages for the corporate cartels, cheap labor, no capital investment. And for the advanced sector, we're seeing increasing deindustrialization and austerity under the green policy. And we're looking at this as an ongoing banking collapse in the West, but it's not a banking collapse, it's an economic collapse. And in the midst of this, the global South is in a rebellious mood, essentially rejecting the idea of existing in a neo-imperial system. And we see this in terms of the refusal of many nations to support the sanctions against Russia. We see it in terms of moves toward de-dollarization. But it's a defense of the sovereign rights of nations to act for the benefit of their population, which includes self-government, as opposed to international institutions giving orders, the so-called rules-based order. And we're seeing Russia and China at the center of this. The BRICS as an institution, the BRICS Development Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative is a new economic development model. And this is moving towards what Helga has been calling for, the idea of a new strategic and new development architecture. And there's a push to end the war, as we see from the Pope, from President Xi of China, his call to Zelensky, Lula of Brazil, even within the NATO with the European Union and Turkey, very much involved in push for negotiations. But the whole point is, who's pushing for more war? And I just want to refer to something Helga mentioned about the Cleverly Blinken discussion earlier last week. Cleverly said that the Brits will continue to support the war for Ukraine, irrespective of whether this forthcoming offensive generates huge gains on the battlefields. He said there are no certainties, but he said that it's absolutely certain that they will continue to support Ukraine, and Blinken confirmed that the U.S. is totally in sync with the British on that. And as if to make the point, that same day, President Biden allocated another $1.2 billion in military aid for Ukraine. You also had the announcement of new weapons going to Ukraine from the British in particular. And these included the so-called Storm Shadow cruise missiles, which are long range, which can hit Crimea. Remember, the Brits were the first ones to push for the tanks and to put pressure on Germany so that Germany would provide tanks for Ukraine. They sent depleted uranium shells to Ukraine for use, despite the human rights violations implicit with these things. And now with the Storm Shadow, it does put Crimea in range. And this was emphasized by the British Defense Minister Ben Wallace, who said, these missiles have already been delivered. And he said, quote, this will give Ukraine capability to make Crimea untenable for Russian forces. And this is, in a sense, the project of the Royal United Services, the Atlantic Council, and others, who have called for freeing Crimea from the Russians and returning it back to Ukrainian sovereignty. So what is it we see with the Biden policy, the Blinken, Cleverly discussion, the supplying of more weapons. It's a commitment to permanent war, endless war, which serves the purpose of the broad grouping known as neoconservatives in both parties in the United States. What role does war play? Well, it diverts from the real needs. You have a rejection of the legitimate security concerns of nations, and instead, nations must subordinate their policies to the so-called rules-based order. And if you don't, you face coups, you face color revolutions, and war. More importantly, it undermines the potential for a future based on mutually beneficial cooperation for real economic development. And that's what the discussion is coming out from the Global South now. How to overcome the enforced underdevelopment of the colonial era, which has continued in its present form. Now, I want to just take a quick look at some aspect of this question of what are the neoconservatives and what do they want? What are they trying to do? And look at it from the comments of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., talking about the danger of permanent war, but then bringing up the question of the role of the CIA in the assassination of his uncle, President John F. Kennedy. This is quite significant, extremely important, because it gets to the core of the problem. How were both parties in the United States taken over after World War II by this neoconservative presence? On the Republican side, you had Eisenhower, who had, on his way out of office, warned of the danger of the military-industrial complex, a term which is now synonymous with not just the defense sector, but the movement to establish a control over all elements of economic and strategic policy by corporate cartels, not just defense industry, but banks, financial, insurance, raw materials. The name BlackRock is a perfect example of this. But Eisenhower warned about it. And in the Democratic Party, you had the Franklin Roosevelt tradition in terms of the commitment to the ideals of the United Nations, and President Kennedy, who moved very directly to rejecting the influence of the CIA and the War Party when he was faced with the danger of nuclear war with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, the post-World War II neoconservative movement, and I'm just going to throw a couple of things out here for further discussion, because we do need to investigate this much more. We've been on this case for a long time. Over my shoulder, you can see the book Children of Satan, which reviews the role of the Leo Strauss networks with people like Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney. But this goes back to the end of World War II and the Dulles Network. Allen Dulles, who not only was the head of the CIA for a number of years, who was fired by John Kennedy, but then played a leading role in the cover-up of the investigation into the assassination as the coordinator of the Warren Commission that looked into the Kennedy assassination. But I'll just throw out a few names for you, and we can take this up in the question and answer, and I'm sure we'll be doing more work on this in the weeks to come. But the role of something called the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was a project that Allen Dulles sent his top operative, Frank Wisner, to London in 1951 to work with the British Secret Intelligence Service to establish this as a permanent operation against any attempt to have peace with the Soviet Union. One of the leading officials in this group was Lord Bertrand Russell, who actually had advocated a few years earlier a preemptive nuclear strike on the Soviet Union. Irving Kristol was a leading figure in this. Kristol became the co-editor with Stephen Spender, a leading British Fabian Society member, in a magazine called Encounter, which was designed to create a movement of intellectuals in support of the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And you had a merger in the United States into this group of former leftists, Trotskyites. I mean, Irving Kristol came out of the Trotsky movement, British Fabians, and so on, with hardcore conservatives, anti-communists, you might say. And in the 1950s to the 1980s, the enemy for this group was the Soviet Union. What happened after the fall of the Soviet Union is that the same enemy remained. It was no longer communism, it was Russia. But this goes back to the tradition of British geopolitics, which identifies Russia as the leading opponent of the imperial system, which at the beginning of the 20th century was dominated by London. By the end of the 20th century was an American or an Anglo-American special relationship. And that's what's behind the rules-based order. So if you're going to take on this question of the war party, the war hawks in both parties that control both parties, you have to address the role of the CIA back then in setting up this operation initially, and how elements of these same intelligence services today are behind the continuation of the war against Russia in Ukraine. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm very intrigued to hear Ray's comments, because I think as a former CIA official, he has a lot of thoughts on these that are extremely urgent for us to think about.
What I want to do, Harley, before we go to Ray, is, given that we are having this discussion in this way, something's important to know or recognize. JFK was president 10 presidents ago, and much, if not most, of the United States population was not born when the events occurred in Dallas. So the importance of JFK as a president and the presidency itself is not that well remembered or known. I think it's important that we might hear from RFK Jr. We have a brief clip, who, while he was not an eyewitness to the assassination itself, was an eyewitness to his father's reaction to the assassination. So we'll play that first and then go to Ray after that.
The day that my uncle was killed, I was picked up at Sidwell Friends School and brought home. The first phone call that my father made after J. Edgar Hoover told him that his brother had been shot was to the CIA desk officer in Langley, who was only a mile from our house. Yeah. And my father said to him, "Did your people do this?" His next call was to Harry Ruiz, who was one of the Cuban Bay of Pigs leaders who had remained very, very close to our family and to my father. My father asked him the same question. Then my father called John McComb, who was the head of the CIA, and asked him to come to the house. McComb came over, and when I came home from Sidwell Friends School, my father was walking in the yard with John McComb, and my father was posing the same question to him. Was it our people who did this to my brother? So it was my father's first instinct that the agency had killed his brother.
Now, Ray, I regard that statement by that person now to be revelatory. Some people talk about, well, these statements have been made before. No Kennedy has ever said that before. That was said in less than 2 minutes, and clearly means something, especially in a time when certain other heads of state are asserting that persons or persons unknown and institutions or institutions unknown are attempting assassinations against them. So if you would, apart from all the things you always do anyway, and whatever else you'd like to talk about, give us your thoughts about what has happened with this statement and sort of what's been happening in the last week to 2 weeks in our world.
Thanks, Dennis. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're very, very clear.
Good. Okay. Well, first off, I'm not vainglorious enough to think that I'm worth assassinating. But just for the record, okay, I've never felt better in my life. The open heart stuff really worked. I have no bills unpaid that I know about. I'm feeling great, okay? So if something untoward happens to me, just on the off chance, and I wish this were funny, it's not. Look into it, okay? At least I can depend on you all to kind of look into it, because I've been rather outspoken last week or so. I said, if Bobby Kennedy can be outspoken, so can Ray McGovern, the more so since he was working in the CIA at the time his uncle was assassinated and his father was assassinated. So that having been said, there are other things that came out this past week. On Monday, I had my Monday with the judge session, Judging Freedom, his Judge Napolitano's little broadcast. And before we went on, he asked me, well, Ray, is there something else you'd like to discuss? I have these things. And I said, yeah, Bobby Kennedy has talked about the CIA being responsible for killing his father or for his uncle. And I said, I can talk about that if you like. So the judge accommodated me. He earmarked about 10, 12 minutes toward the end of the 22 minutes or whatever we had to talk about this. And the reason I mention this is because the judge cranked some new information into this equation. I had ranted and raved about the notion that all presidents seem to be afraid to do what they must do by act of Congress, and that is release the remaining pages of the CIA and FBI records on the JFK assassination. Most recently, Trump, maybe 3-4 years ago, got up and said, okay, today's the day that I'm required by law to release the rest of these papers. They'll be released. Not very long thereafter, he got up and said, oh, and this is a paraphrase of what he said. He said, the CIA and the FBI have told me, you can't release those, How long did they have to sanitize them? 30 years plus? I mean, anyhow, long story short, that spoke volumes to me. And I sort of poured my heart out to the judge. I said, that really tells me something. And he says, and this is the point here, he says, Ray, let me tell you, President Trump used to call me from time to time, and he did so 2 or 3 weeks before the end of his administration, and he wanted to have my advice on certain people he was thinking of pardoning and so forth, and so I helped him on that. I'm not going to talk in detail about that, of course, but this is on the record. But what's not on the record is this, Ray. I said, Mr. President, as a last request, are you going to fulfill your promise to the American people to release the rest of the JFK assassination documents? And he said, Judge Napolitano said, President Trump told me, I can talk about this. I can talk about this when there are not 15 other people listening in on the White House switchboard. But let me tell you now, Judge, if you saw what I've seen, you would understand why I could never release those documents. Period. End quote. Now, I'm taken aback a little bit, but I have the presence of mind to say, Judge Napolitano, what's the teaching point here? Who the hell is running this country? I mean, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to see that if the CIA and the FBI are reluctant to release these documents, well, hello, it's a little suspicious, isn't it? It suggests that they have something to hide. Now, this led me into another interview in which I said, I spent 27 years with the CIA as an analyst. I spent more time still with the 2 other years with Army intelligence. I know how the intelligence setup of this country is supposed to work. It doesn't anymore. I was always reluctant to be seen, or to militate for throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Let me explain. The baby was what Truman created. He wanted one place to go for unvarnished, he called it untainted, untreated intelligence. One place. He didn't want agency corruption from the Pentagon or from the State Department. He wanted a group responsive to him alone. Our careers depended on the White House alone, and we were to tell them the truth. Whoa! That's why it came down after JFK appealed to those of us who had something special to offer. Mine was a master's degree in Russian studies and fluency in the language, some teaching experience. And that's why I was down there in the first place, because I was really attracted to this notion of one place which could tell the truth without fear or favor. And we were able to do that for most of my career. When Bill Casey and Bobby Gates came to the fore, well, the Russians became devils, and nobody could say anything about it. But for a while, it really worked. It also worked on places like Iran. Now, this has to do with the baby, okay? It's very clear. It's clear from Bush's own memoir that he and Cheney wanted to start a war on behalf of Israel with Iran before they rode out into the sunset in the West and leave the mess to the next administration. Why is that clear? It's clear as a bell. And to their credit, there were enough people in the Congress at that time, no more, unfortunately, but at that time, they said, look, where's the national intelligence estimate on how close Iran is to getting a nuclear weapon? We've been saying 5 years, but we've been saying that for 20 years. Every 5 years, we said, they're 5 years away. What's going on here? Well, they looked around for an honest chairman of an estimate of this kind. They couldn't find one in the CIA. The CIA was still dusting itself off from the debacle of the estimate that justified all those weapons of mass destruction, talked about ties between Iraq and Al-Qaeda, which didn't exist. So there was nobody around. So what did they do? They went to the State Department, which had taken many footnotes in that earlier estimate, and they said, Tom Finger, who was head of the State Intelligence Unit, Intelligence and Research, would you do it? Finger said, are you crazy? I'm not going to go into that lion's den, for God's sake. No, Tom. We'll give you. You could take your own honest people with you. The ones that took footnotes on that early estimate, and we'll give you as much time as you want, and we'll keep it all secret. Please do it. And Tom said yes. Long story short, they threw out all the previous estimates. They looked at the real evidence. They were fortunate in getting some new evidence, which was really helpful. And in November 2007, they issued an estimate, okay? And the estimate said Iran is not working on a nuclear weapon. That estimate said that with unanimous consent of all, I think there were 16 intelligence agencies at the time, and with high confidence. Whoa, best of all, since Congress had requested an estimate, it couldn't be suppressed. Went out there into the airwaves, and Bush later complained, my God, that took the military option away from me. For how could I authorize airstrikes on a country that the intelligence community says has no active nuclear weapons program? Oh, damn. Now, what am I saying? I'm saying that I've been around for a couple of decades and more, okay? I know of no other national intelligence estimate that played a huge role in stopping a god-awful war. We had just been into Iraq. Now we're going to take off after Iran, prompted by some of the same people who are really, really goading us on to take out Saddam Hussein because he was a threat to Israel. Okay, There's more to it than that, but that was part of it. So, what am I saying? There's a baby, for God's sake. You don't want to throw that baby out with the bathwater. And so 2007, next decade, I'm still saying, no, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But now I have to say that since John Brennan put the assessments, the intelligence substantive people together with the operatives now, so that they're picking targets for drones and they're saying, well, it'd probably be okay maybe to blow up pipe streams and stuff, you know. In other words, the analysts, as was always the temptation, are now totally put under all this money that the operatives got. And even though Cy Hirsch says that when this cockamamie scheme about blowing up the pipeline was first voiced, there were a few analysts at the very top. The only one that knew about it was say, well, I don't know about this. Have you thought about what that would mean for your major ally in Europe, like the Germans? And I hope it's going to come out who did it. You know? None of that. So my bottom line now is that you need to disestablish the whole Central Intelligence, the whole National Intelligence setup. I just add a word: the National Intelligence Director. What's that all about? That's all about Congress trying to do something ostensibly useful after the debacle of 9/11. Was there enough intelligence available to stop 9/11? Surely there was, and we can prove it. Was it stopped at the highest levels? Yes, it was, and we can prove that too. But instead of facing into that, the 9/11 Commission, I know this firsthand, okay? After the 9/11 Commission issued their really well-written report, I was asked by the BBC to go next door or across the street to their studio and critique it. Well, I'm waiting there in their balloon room, and in comes Senator Slade Gordon from the state of Washington. And I say, Senator Gordon, good to see you. Now, tell me, you keep telling me that no one's in charge of the intelligence community, so you have to create this superstructure that will so somebody can be in charge of the whole thing. That's not going to work. The Director of Central Intelligence already has the authority to bang heads and get things done. It's just that George Tenet didn't do it. And he looked at me and says, Ray, you're telling me the lights are on. I know that. We all know that. But we have to do something. We have to look like we're doing something. So it was all cosmetic, and it was noxious. And so was the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. Purely bureaucratic maneuvers to deceive the American people into thinking they were attacking the problem. That's not the problem. The problem is people. The problem is integrity. The problem is honesty. And so all I'm saying here is that if you get people let me say a word about the current National Intelligence Director. Now, her name is Avril Haines, and she's an intelligent National Intelligence Director, but she really doesn't know anything about intelligence with a capital I, okay? What am I saying? Well, I'm saying that she's plumbing for policy. She told Fareed Zakaria 2 months ago, if we just keep plumbing, just pumping all these weapons into Ukraine, they're heroically, her word, they're heroically performing, and this is coming just fine. And besides, you know what, says Avril Haines in January, okay, the Russians are running out of ammunition, they're running out of supplies, and they don't have any indigenous capability to to construct or make those, put those weapons into play. The Russians really are behind the 8 ball here, whereas Ukrainians are getting a lot of help. I have a lot of optimism, says Avril Haines, that the Ukrainians can bring this one off. Huh? Where the hell is she getting her information? Well, I know where. It comes from the Department of Defense. And who runs the Department of Defense? His name is, what's his name? Austin, Lloyd Austin. And who was he before? He was a 4-star general, okay? And where did he work? He worked in Tampa, Florida, for CENTCOM. He was the CENTCOM commander. And what happened there? 50 plus intelligence analysts filed a formal complaint with the Inspector General of the Pentagon saying that when we send up our untreated intelligence, it gets treated, right? It gets changed. It's a completely different story than we're telling about the progress of the good terrorists in Syria. And Austin is the guy and the people that he has working for him. There's a big investigation. Wow. I don't want to. You won't be surprised to find out that, well, it was almost okay what Austin did. Now, that is unprecedented in my experience, which goes back decades. Okay, never before have 50 plus intelligence analysts working for the military petitioned the Inspector General of the Pentagon that, look, our intelligence is being corrupted. Now, where is Avril Haines learning about this rosy outlook for the Ukrainian services and how the Russians are really taking it on the chin? He's getting it from the equivalent of the people in CENTCOM who were forced to do General Austin's bidding. And where do they get it? They get it from liaison. What? Liaison? Liaison is the Ukrainians, for God's sake. I'm sorry, but this is such a prostitution, such a corruption of the intelligence profession that I have to laugh. Otherwise, I'm going to cry. Okay, so that's Avril Haines. Now, how about one more thing? How about Bill Burns? Now, I have a little bit of a history with Bill Burns. First, a little personal anecdote. Bill Burns, while he was waiting for the Democrats to regain the presidency, he was the president of the Carnegie Institute. And so he used to run these big affairs. And I don't know who put it in his head, but James Clapper used to be the director of national intelligence. He used to say, oh, those Russians, I know those Russians. They're almost, what's the word? They're almost genetically, that's what he said. They're almost genetically driven to be deceptive, to push on their tongue. I know about the Russians. That's what the Russians are. Okay, so Clapper writes a book, his memoir, and he's peddling it. And so he wants to go before the anointed people at the Carnegie Foundation. And Bill Burns says, okay. So he gives him this really flowery introduction. Now, this may be of use to people who have a chance to go to these things now. I went about a half hour early and bought the book. $18. I bought it anyway, okay? I went into the men's room and I read through it, okay? And I said, what does he say about Iraq? Oh my God! So, Q&A, Governor raises his hand and he says, Joe Clapper, you were in charge of imagery intelligence on Iraq, right? Yes, I was. Yeah, I was head of the National Imagery and Mapping Agency, yes. Mm-hmm. You say in your book that you were under great pressure from Dick Cheney to find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, correct? Oh, yeah. And then you say that you worked so hard and we were driven so hard that you found things that weren't really there. That's a quote from your book. Is that correct? Yes, sir. my God, you know. and so I said, well, now how do you adjust that? Well, I admit in the book, it wasn't just me, of course. It was the rest of the community. It was such great pressure from Dick Cheney. I said, well, tell me this, General Clapper. It was really neat. I had about 4 minutes. I said, now you were in the forefront of those claiming that the Russians hacked into the Democratic National Committee computers and gave those very damaging to Hillary emails to WikiLeaks. Oh, she, oh yeah. I said, well, we have two former technical directors from NSA working with us veteran intelligence professionals for sanity, and they tell us it didn't happen. It couldn't happen. They have forensic evidence. They have the principles of physics, and they have the slides that Ed Snowden brought out to Hong Kong to prove that was a hoax. Okay, how do you react to that? Well, no, I would talk to NSA. I know NSA. I know SIGINT. No. Well, how do you account for the fact, Mr. Clapper, that President Obama himself, 2 weeks before he left office, said, I don't know how these emails got to WikiLeaks. How do you explain it? I can't answer for what the president says. And Bill Burns said, I guess that's enough, Mr. McGovern. That's enough. Okay, well, what's my point here? My point is that Bill Burns is a cog in the bureaucracy. He's president of the Carnegie Council because he's a safe guy. He's going to have clowns like Clapper talk about books that no one really understands the significance of unless they go in the men's room a half hour early, right? Look in the index, okay? So that was the personal thing. Now, how about professionally? What was I going to say about Clapper professionally? Well, he was head of the National Imagery and Mapping Agency, and he admits that he found things that weren't really there. Now, this is the guy who's now a big, CNN or NBC, I guess CNN guy, and he's sort of the fount of all wisdom. I guess how I got into this was Bill Burns, okay? And let me just finish. Sorry to carry on so much. This is kind of fun because it's so bad. I mean, it's probably a good story, huh? Okay, here we go. January, February 2008. Rumors all over the place that NATO is going to incorporate Ukraine and Georgia. Whoa, the last straw, okay? What happens? On the 1st of February, Sergei Lavrov, just recently appointed at that point to be Minister of Foreign Affairs, calls in our ambassador. Who's our ambassador? Oh, a guy named Bill Burns, okay? He says, Mr. Burns, do you know what "niet" means? And Burns said, oh, sure, it means no. "Niet" means "niet," Mr. Burns. If you bring Ukraine into NATO or Georgia, we will have to react. That would be a red line. You understand what a red line is, okay? Now, there will be, as far as Ukraine is concerned, there will be a civil war, and we Russians will have to decide whether we need to intervene in Ukraine. We don't want to have to do that, okay? So please, Mr. Burns, tell your people, "Niet" means "niet." That's our red line. Now, 2008, February 1, he's an ambassador. He knows that this might not be a very welcome thing to say to Condoleezza Rice, who's working for Dick Cheney, but he writes anyway. The title of the cable from Moscow, and if I've seen one cable from Moscow, Embassy Moscow, probably about 3,000, it says, "Niet" means "niet," Russia's red line on admission of Ukraine and Georgia to NATO, okay? Clear as a bell, okay? So what happens? Well, that was the 1st of February 2008. On April 3rd, so 2 months later, Bucharest, summit of NATO leaders, declaration on the 3rd of April, Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. Okay, what's the point of these remarks? The point of these remarks is now Bill Burns has forgotten all that. When Sergei Lavrov said the equivalent of, if you let Ukraine into NATO, that will provoke us into deciding whether we have to intervene or not. His words, it's in the cable. We have the cable thanks to WikiLeaks, okay? Instead of remembering that, what does the head of the CIA, who's supposed to be doing honest analysis, say? Oh my God, that was a terrible invasion. It was totally unprovoked. So all I'm saying here is that the head of the CIA and the head of the National Intelligence Directorate, they should be intelligence officers, not plumbing for this or that policy, and they shouldn't lie about things. And, to see Bill Burns, who had a pretty good reputation up till then, just be subordinate to being a propagandist rather than an intelligence officer really hurts because I saw the agency working in a functional way. It's no longer functional. All these things I kind of used to say, all right, there's no more baby. Throw the baby out with the bathwater. Get some sort of institution that can have some pretense to have an agenda-free analytic capability. And then if you want to blow up pipelines and stuff like that, yeah, put it in the Pentagon where it belongs. And let's start anew, because right now the CIA and this superstructure is worse than nothing.
Well, I want to say thank you, but I'm not sure I should.
I'm feeling really good. Remember that.
Yeah, I heard you very clearly about that. So Harley, I'm going to ask you if you have any comment or response to what you've just heard, which many others will have a response to. We'll have to help Ray out about that, because that was not your normal Saturday afternoon evaluation.
Well, I mean, there's a lot in what Ray's saying, because he's someone who's been there, been in the middle of it, has seen these things, knows the people involved. And I think that's the starting point in looking into this. I would just add that one of the points that Lyndon LaRouche always emphasized was the degree to which the Dulles networks, the originators of the Central Intelligence Agency, were heavily influenced by the role of the British intelligence. In particular, at that time, the Churchill influence on Truman. Remember, Franklin Roosevelt died before the war ended. Truman came in, and Truman was very much dependent on advisors who were working closely with British Secret Intelligence Service. And that tradition has continued. And we see it in the so-called special relationship, which is, as far as I know, the concept is attributed to Churchill when he went to speak with Truman in Fulton, Missouri. So if you look at this question then of who's benefiting from the policies of the intelligence community, who's writing the script that Tenet had, for example, on Iraq, where did that come from? That came from Sir Richard Dearlove, who was the head of MI6, from Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And if you want to look at the continuity, what did Richard Dearlove do 2 weeks ago? He flew to Kiev to send the message to Zelensky, you must not respond to President Xi. There must be no negotiations until there's a final victory for Ukraine. So I think one of the key stories to look at here is this long-time relationship between British intelligence and the U.S. intelligence community. And this is not to impugn the integrity of all the men and women who served in the CIA, but where you do have the political hacks like the Clappers, the Brennans, I think Lloyd Austin is another one of those. Remember, Lloyd Austin went to Raytheon after the military. That's a direct position of the military-industrial complex. So you have to look at these things and look at who benefits from the policies. And it's not just that money's going into the war. What is it they're trying to stop by having these wars? And I think that's what we're seeing emerge with the global South linking up with Russia and China. And what Mrs. LaRouche has emphasized is that what is necessary for the United States and for Western Europe is to break with this idea of a rules-based order, which is rules that benefit the corporate industrial complex, and instead go into an alliance for a new development architecture with the BRICS, with the global South. And so I think it's very useful to, there's so much more we have to do to piece this together, but I think this is where what Ray's anecdotes demonstrate is the pure hackery and fraud coming from people who should know better. And where that comes from and who benefits from it, that's what the American people need to know.
Okay, now we have several questions. I'm going to let you respond, Ray, and then give you something additional to work with. Go ahead. I'll let you respond to Harley.
Okay, a couple of general points and then some specific points. I'll try not to carry on too long here. Yeah, Harvey's incredibly right. When the CIA was set up, and even before, with respect to its antecedents, the British were pretty much running the place. I mean, when the freely elected leader of Iran, Mossadegh, okay, elected in 51, 52, okay, the first freely elected head of Iran in 4 millennia. When he got it into his head that, hey, that oil, that's worth a lot of money. Maybe we Iranians should be able to profit from that, and not just the British. And he thought about, well, maybe we'll nationalize that oil. Well, what happened? MI6 put their arm around this fledgling CIA, Kermit Roosevelt among them, and said, hey, this is what you do when an upstart out there in the third world thinks that the oil underneath the sand of his country belongs to him. And what happened there, 1953. Same thing happened in 1954 in Guatemala. What you had was United Fruit having domain of all a good portion of the territory of Guatemala. The peasants wanted to have a little bit more even share. United Front came in and said, this guy is a leftist. You got to get rid of him. He's going to be making this place a communist place. And so 1954, that. Then, of course, in Chile, 1973. So Britain has been, very much involved in all of this. And when Sir Richard Dearlove, I love these names, Dearlove and Cleverly. I think Foreign Minister Cleverly is cleverly too much by half. Anyhow, all right. So you have Dearlove, right? What happens? Well, he wants to find out what's going on with this attack on Iraq. Now, Bush and Blair have been talking about it, but the head of MI6 doesn't know about it. That's this guy, Dearlove, okay? So Blair says, Dearlove, you go talk to George Tenet. He sees the president much more often than anybody else. He's head of intelligence. He's pretty free, pretty candid. Maybe he'll tell us what's going on, because these weekly conversations on the phone between Bush and Blair, they're not doing it for us. Okay, so they send him in July 2002 to Washington. Tenet meets with him for hours on the 20th of July. I know some people who were there. It's clear what eventuated. On the 23rd of July, 3 days later, Dearlove briefed Blair and about 13 of his disciples there that surrounded the table. And what he said was this, very clear. He said, look, Bush has decided he's going to make war on Iraq. The war will be justified by the juxtaposition of weapons of mass destruction and ties with Al-Qaeda, okay? And the facts are being fixed around the intelligence, and the facts are being fixed around the policy, period, end quote. That's, you can check me on that. That's a quote. So was this a British American plot? Of course it was. Would Bush have gone alone ahead without Blair toting behind as a little poodle? I don't know, but the British are equally responsible for that debacle, okay? And, I think Helga is absolutely right when you see the new King Charles with his, I remember my Irish grandmother. She was in London when the troops were going out to the Boer War. She was a seamstress. She worked for a very rich lady. The lady said, Jane, you go down to the Hyde Park at this gate, you'll see Queen Victoria come out in a carriage. And to hear my grandmother describe it, there were all kinds of, that's a stroke of noon. The gates opened, and there were Japanese fellas hanging all over the couch, and the coach comes, and I was standing right a couple of feet from her. The window was open, and so I said, well, Queen, how the hell are you? But I don't think she heard me. So that's what brought to mind, hello, what's with this business? So, so the British are, now, okay, that's the past. Okay, now let's talk about the British now. What are they doing? They hit Luhansk City with one of those 150-mile new, storm shadow missiles. That's trouble, folks. That's trouble, okay? What else are they doing? They're supplying depleted uranium shells. Now, for anti-tank weapons and other stuff. Now, some of you may not know this, but the half-life of the uranium that's left, the poison that's left on these fields in Ukraine is almost always, right? It's forever. And what do we know from, actually, we used it in the old Yugoslavia, we used it in Fallujah, in Iraq, and there were incredible increases in the rates of birth defects. It's hard to even look at the pictures, okay? So, my question, who cares most about Ukrainian people? Zelensky, who's going to let portions of his country be poisoned by depleted uranium? Or Putin, who claims to find Ukrainian people a brotherly nation, common Slavic heritage? I think we're going to see which one feels more strongly about that. Last but not least, there's the whole nuclear business. Now, you may recall that Liz Truss, who is prime minister for a couple of months, way back a couple of years ago, she was asked, now, would you be willing to use a nuclear weapon? And she said, and I wrote it down here, it's so bizarre, I don't want to misquote her. She says, oh yes, I would be quite ready to use nuclear weapons, even though this might destroy a lot of more things than we really intend. I'm quite ready. It was only then, a few days later, that Vladimir Putin said, look, please don't forget, we also have nuclear weapons, okay? Now, don't forget that, because you really ought to crank that into the equation. And I see just one ray of light in all this stuff that's happened. The darkness comes from what the British are now doing. I think Blinken told them to do that. Just met very cleverly with cleverly, right? Okay. How about Sullivan? Jacob Sullivan, who advises the president as his national security advisor. What's he doing? Whoa! Is it true that he met with the very, very top Communist Party of China Central Commission on Foreign Affairs? Yes. They just say hi. 2 days. 2 days in Vienna. When? 2 days and 1 day ago. What's that all about? Well, I think there are some rays of hope here that sensibility is going to sink in, and that whereas for the nonce, Putin and Xi have to consider the people advising Biden as crazy, a word that Putin has used. For the nonce, they have to depend on that. Whether they become less crazy when this Ukrainian counteroffensive sort of peters out and it becomes clear that Ukraine is not winning, whether it becomes clear that the British really shouldn't be doing this stuff, these things are fired from aircraft, and remember where you heard it first. I think the next one will be shut down hopefully over Ukraine, but if it's over Poland, well, you might have a little cause célèbre here, maybe have a real problem, okay? So I'll end with that, but these are little points that relate to the situation we're in today. It's coming to a head, okay? In another month, we're going to know about the counteroffensive or whether it's been postponed some more, and we're going to know whether the Chinese initiative and the Pope's initiative hold any promise of getting people's heads screwed on right.
Okay, I'm going to go to a couple of questions and then go to a piece of video I think is important to show and to get a response from both of you on. But the question is also directed to both of you. This is from Howard. And he says the following. Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is now in the Israeli government, as a young man, was part of a dry run of the assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin by stealing the ornament from Rabin's car and displaying it on Israeli television saying, quote, "We can get Rabin." What does this mean for the present war danger? It seems that the current shooting war with Islamic Jihad in Gaza is about to end, but is this the next big war? So, Harley, let me go to you first, and then Ray, to you.
Well, there are all sorts of factors in play when you're dealing with the Israeli situation. But one of the most important is Netanyahu. And Netanyahu's survival depends on maintaining the Israeli population in fear that their security is at threat. And this is something that's been played over and over and over again by Sharon, by others, but especially Netanyahu. And Netanyahu's alliance with the increasingly more so-called right-wing or aggressive settlers movement has created the basis for him to do these kinds of things. Now, the question that comes up that Howard's raising is that some of these settlers who are now in the mainstream in Netanyahu's coalition were the same people who were supporting and may have been involved in the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in opposition to his attempt with Shimon Peres and with Arafat to solve the problem through Oslo. And the key to Oslo, as Lyndon LaRouche pointed out at the time, the Oslo Agreement was economic development. That Peres in particular emphasized that a Palestinian state as it exists in Gaza today and in the West Bank today is unsupportable. There's no income, there's no future. But that the idea of Oslo was economic accords for development. And that was what was toasted to when Rabin and Arafat and Bill Clinton were meeting at the White House. A moment there could have been hope for an end to that situation, that continuing crisis. And the assassination of Rabin set back things in many, many directions, but it paved the way for Netanyahu to use the security situation for his own purposes to stay in power. Now, keep in mind also the whole question of judicial reform is causing a tremendous reaction in the population in Israel. And it's not unrelated to both the security question and also to the fact that Netanyahu is facing a criminal indictment, very serious charges against him that could lead to him being bounced out of office. So what do you do in a situation like that? Why not have a war? So I think that's the significance of this Ben-Gvir and his networks that are driving, along with Netanyahu, this security situation. I don't have a lot of hope that there's going to be a ceasefire and an end to this, because it's not really in the interests of Netanyahu and his people. And at this point, it's not in the interests of Islamic Jihad and Hamas either.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Ray, any response?
Yeah, I think this is a really important issue. I think people need to understand that Israel is on its back foot here. Iran and Saudi Arabia are together now, thanks to the conciliation efforts of the Chinese, of all people. The Israeli populace, in my view, is divided as never before. There are actually people in Israel afraid for their own democracy. That's a good thing, okay? Netanyahu, that's a bad thing. Now, how do the Israelis look at Syria? Well, we know. Back in September of 2013, when Shia and Sunni were at each other's throats in Syria, the chief of the Jerusalem bureau of the New York Times, Jody Ruderin, went and talked to top Israeli officials. You get to do that if you're bureau chief at New York Times, okay? So one of them, Alon Pinkas, who was consul general in the United States in New York, he said, "Now, Jody, you asked me what Israel's preferred outcome in Syria is. And I have to tell you, quite frankly, it's no outcome. It's just trying to be safe, s'il vous plaît. I mean, no outcome." He said, "Yeah, as I say, it doesn't sound really good. But as long as the Shia and Sunni are at each other's throats, as long as the blood is flowing and they're both hemorrhaging, Israel has nothing to fear from Syria." So that's the deal, okay? Whoa. Did she report that back to New York? She did. Did it get published? It was just around the Labor Day weekend. The censors were all out at Southampton, Long Island, drinking martinis. It got the lead on September 6th, 2013. Look it up. There it is. Laid out. As long as there's chaos in Syria, Israel has no problem with no threat from Syria. The other thing, of course, is the Golan Heights that have now been annexed. And if memory serves, Trump approved that, said he thought that was a good idea to annex the Golan Heights from Syria. So there's a lot at stake for Israel. And my fear is that they will take advantage of whatever happens in Ukraine, the diversion of attention from things right there in Israel, to allow Netanyahu to do what Sharon did after 9/11. That is, drive the tanks in there and take care of the Gaza problem, the Gaza concentration camp with 2 million people in it at once and for all. He can't do that, but he can try, and he can wreak an awful lot of damage in the process.
Okay, we have another question which I want to pose here. I'm just trying to get it to come up. All right, and this one, Harley, I'm going to go to you on this first as well, from Munasha. And he's asking, what can be deduced from the U.S. Ambassador Ruben Bridgetti's remarks that South Africa is supplying weapons to Russia? Is Africa safe from such pressure? I think we should note that, in fact, he was forced to recall those remarks, I believe. So
Yeah.
if you could just maybe brief everyone that's listening to us today about where we stand on this matter right now.
Well, South Africa is a big problem for the Biden administration because as part of the BRICS, the South Africans have been consistent in their unwillingness to support the sanctions against Russia and support the war. Blinken made a trip there, and Blinken tried to impress upon the foreign minister of South Africa that the United States doesn't appreciate their position. And she said to him, Mr. Secretary, let me remind you, South Africa is a sovereign nation, and we don't appreciate you coming here to bully us. Now, the South African Navy did some maneuvers with the Russian Navy, nothing too significant except the fact that it happened. And then this story came out from the United States, from some of the same networks that Ray's been talking about, that said that South Africa is supplying weapons to Russia. And it was the U.S. ambassador who was putting that story out. And he was forced to acknowledge that it was not true and to apologize. Now, this is the kind of thing that doesn't happen that often, an apology for a lie that could have provoked an extreme consequence. So I think it's just worth noting that this is part of what the U.S. is, to the extent the U.S. is committed to this permanent war policy, it's driving the rest of the world away. Instead of enforcing the power of the so-called rules-based order, the rest of the world is saying, these are not really rules. These are not laws that we recognize. These are the same kind of colonial demands that have been engaged in our looting over the last 2 centuries, and we're not going to put up with it anymore. So I think it's unusual that the story came out, that the U.S. had to backtrack the charge, but it does show the degree to which there's tension between the U.S., which sends diplomats, including Kamala Harris, who's not actually an accomplished diplomat at all, but to try to bully countries to support the Western narrative against Russia and China. And I think it was important that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. made this comment, and I think others have made a similar comment, but he said, why is China making progress with relations with African nations? Well, when the Chinese go in, they build bridges, they build railroads, they build power units and dams. When the U.S. goes in, we blow them up. So I think this is partly the indication that the South Africans stood up again against this bullying is part of what Ray is pointing to as a potential beam of light in an otherwise dark circumstance.
Okay, Ray, any thoughts about this?
I couldn't add a word. I really appreciate and agree with what Harley said.
Okay, what we'll do is we have several other questions, but we're going to go for a minute to a video, which was Lyndon LaRouche referring to the Kennedy assassination. It was taken out of a much larger interview. This was done at the time that he was in prison. I think it might have been 1990, 91, I'm not certain. But if we can roll that right now.
Welcome to the International Connection. Today we continue our conversation with Lyndon LaRouche from his jail cell in Alexandria, Virginia.
The point is, was Kennedy killed because he was John F. Kennedy? Or was President Kennedy killed because he was president?
That's the problem.
And that's right, and I lean to the second one.
Because he was the president.
That's right. He happened to have the misfortune of being the president at the time, which is the primary reason for it.
So there were forces. I mean, Kennedy even said there was a government behind his back. There was this group behind him that was orchestrating a lot of these crises.
It was essentially, it's not unknown who they are.
Well, the Rockefellers, would they be part of them?
I think the Rockefellers, that's where I would get off Peter a bit on, with my own view, is that I think that's exaggerated. Yes, the Rockefeller interest is very specific. I know the thing. I've done a lot in exposing it. David Rockefeller is certainly no friend of mine.
Yes.
But I think that misses the point because it makes it too narrow and makes it too linear.
Right. In other words, it's the idea of the Fondi. It's a group of associates.
There's a social formation to the effect that no one individual or no one individual group determines the group. It's the inner within the group that determines what the group does.
Right, and that's why they can't put the finger on who killed Kennedy. Those kind of things. They can't.
More than that, I think the problem is more than that. When you organize an assassination of that type for the President of the United States, a conspiracy which operated on the scale of which that thing operated. Remember, the killing of Kennedy enveloped and overlaid efforts to assassinate Charles de Gaulle.
Yes.
The same operation, in effect.
Yep.
So it's a vast conspiracy. Now, when you get a vast conspiracy, what makes a conspiracy work is a lot of deception within the conspiracy and a lot of exploitation of the particular motivation of people who are drawn into playing particular roles. So that if you interrogate somebody and say who pulled a trigger and say, why was the President of the United States killed? Why'd you shoot him? This fellow might have a motive. He might simply say, because I was paid to do so.
Yes.
Or somebody else might explain a motive. That might have been the motive for their behavior or the induced motive. That doesn't mean that's why the thing happened. So that it comes to a question, the people who planned this, and I don't think I should name it on the air,
yes,
but the people who planned this were functioning at a very high level. So they knew what they were doing, unlike people on a lower level who may not have known fully what they were doing, apart from the killing. And even some didn't know they were involved in the killing.
Say that again?
They knew that they were destabilizing the institution of the presidency of the United States.
You just said those people in the low levels didn't know what they were...
didn't know the full implications of what
they were doing.
They knew what they were doing, but they didn't know what somebody else intended this to lead to.
Yes.
And what they were doing was destabilizing, particularly with a cover-up, the Warren Commission cover-up. The combination of the assassination with the cover-up actually did destabilize the United States, destabilize the institutions of government of the United States, destroyed the presidency as an efficient instrument of government, as a constitutional instrument. And the fellows who organized this thing at that level knew they were doing this. So therefore, I say, they weren't out to kill Kennedy, though somebody may have come up with motives for killing John F. Kennedy. They were out to kill President Kennedy because he was president.
The institution.
The institution.
Okay, I wanted to just get comments from you guys on what you think, agree, disagree, amplify, whatever you think. So, Carly, let me start with you.
Well, I think Lynn had a very particular view of the uniqueness of the American presidency as a leadership capability. And, the idea that the presidential system operates on a much different standard than a parliamentary system. And in that sense, the president has the capability to do things in the United States and worldwide that other governments don't have. And if you look at a lot of the specifics, and I know Ray's done a lot of work on looking at the James Douglas book, The Unspeakable. Douglas does a beautiful job of showing a number of areas where Kennedy was stepping on toes. But he was doing it as a president who was trying to solve problems. He knew there were problems. You had the steel strike. You had the problem coming up with the civil rights movement, the need to address the problem of racism. You had the fact that you had renegades on the Joint Chiefs of Staff who were trying to get us into a war with Russia. So it was on his shoulders that a lot had to be done. And I think that's what Lynn is talking about, that the decision was made they weren't going to allow an individual to get in the way of what was the intent of the policy for the people in the back rooms. So that's just a short offhand summary of, I think, what Lynn was talking about.
And Ray, before you answer, I'd just like to point something out, which I was caused to think, not just by what Lynn said, but, there's the famous speech that Kennedy gave June 10th of 63 at American University. And perhaps we even may have some video of that. We may refer to that before the end of today. And that one, of course, talks a lot about the idea of not just peaceful coexistence, but what is the basis of understanding the mind of an adversary. But for most of my life, certainly through the age of 30, I didn't think about June 10th, 1963. I thought about June 11th, 1963, because that was the day that he first proposed what would later become the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, I saw that speech when he gave it, as did probably nearly everybody else who was African American in America that day. And I cite this because the fact that those two speeches, when that one was very different, that was all on domestic policy, and it was a very specific thing. But the day before, he had given this speech at American University. Clearly, both of those things were more than controversial. And I would argue, actually, they were not really different. They were essentially identical, but there were applicational differences. It was one outlook. So I just wanted to put that in for the purpose of making the conversation even more interesting. Because you say, well, it wasn't Kennedy, it was the presidency. But then, Harley, you just made a point about what it meant that there was a Kennedy in the presidency. So I just wanted to interpolate that because just to see what Ray will do with all of this. So Ray, go ahead.
Thanks to both of you. I'm really informed about what Lyndon LaRouche was saying back then. It was very perspicacious and careful. And now Bobby Kennedy Jr. has said it. What Lyndon said, he couldn't say it on air or couldn't say it. Okay, Bobby Kennedy has said it. My God, we're in a new arena now, and it's a very dangerous one because you're taking on what could be called the national security state, the deep state, if you will, but it's the people who influence elections. It's the people who largely suppress the Hunter Biden business. So who knows whether Biden would have won that election or not. And now people say, well, my God, aren't you glad Biden won that election? Well, yeah, I was. Am I still? No, I don't know. How could Trump's policy be any worse? I'm talking about foreign policy, of course, than Biden's. Anyhow, let me just backtrack for a second. I was 2 months into, I was a member of a staff person, a employee of the CIA for 2 whole months when John Kennedy made that American University speech on the 10th of June, 1963. My God, this was 180 degrees away from the very thick anti-communism that still existed there. The military and the intelligence agencies, everyone was trained to hate the communists and to fear them, sometimes for their own particular advantage. I mean, the military, how could it exist without having somebody to fear and somebody to hate? So it was really a change in tone. And of course, as Jim Douglas and others have pointed out, the president was up against it. And it was only because of very artful maneuvering, political maneuvering, which he did so well, keeping the military out of the negotiations on a limited test ban treaty, okay? The only way he could succeed in doing that was to do that, and that happened. So he announced that in the speech. Now, that was June, okay? Now, I went off to a training course. Some pretty important people were in my class. We were going to be the leaders of the CIA in another decade or two. okay? And into our training course one fine day came a operative from what was called then the Deputy Directorate for Operations. I was amazed. This guy reamed and ranted against John F. Kennedy for having no guts, for being treasonous, for not standing up for defeating Castro. Okay, well, I thought to myself, I remember very distinctly, this is more than odd. Isn't he the president? Well, yeah, he was the president. Well, what is all this? I said to myself, if this guy had the chance, he'd probably kill President Kennedy. Well, I think this fellow was an example of what Lyndon LaRouche is talking about. Somebody at the bottom level there who was taught all the right things about how you don't withdraw from Vietnam, for God's sake, and turn the whole Southeast Asia over to the communists, Chinese, Russians, who in reality were at loggerheads, right? But you don't do that. So somebody with a limited experience will say, this is bad. Okay, I'm going to participate in this plot. But there was more than that. There was the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, they really had it in for Kennedy, and so did Allen Dulles. Now, Allen Dulles had planned this Bay of Pigs operation, okay? April, I think, 1961, okay? So it was right when JFK came into office. They told him about this, and he said, my God, this doesn't sound quite right. I mean, you think you're going to, with this ragtag force, you're going to take out Castro and dominate Cuba? Oh yeah, we're going to do it. Some of them told him, as soon as we land on the beach, there's going to be a popular uprising and Castro will be cast into the sea. Okay. Well, Kennedy says, I don't know about that. Oh yeah, but Eisenhower, your predecessor, he approved it. So they put a lot of pressure on this young president. And still, JFK stood up to them. And he said, all right, look, you think I can do this? I have my doubts. But one thing is certain. Do not expect me to commit regular American forces, Air Force, Army, Navy to this task if you guys get bogged down, okay? I'm not going to do that. So you can go ahead. If you succeed, that's fine. But if you get into trouble, remember, I'm not going to commit those forces. So they go ahead. And as they get bogged down on the beach, they say, all right, now you have to commit. And he said, don't you remember what I told you? And so the whole thing turned out to be a debacle, okay? Now, how do we know that President Kennedy was mousetrapped into this? We know from coffee-stained notes left on Allen Dulles' desk after he died. I have those notes here. I don't want to paraphrase them. Here it is. Okay, here it isn't, but this is what they say. Dulles' notes, Allen Dulles on his desk. When the Enterprise, killing of Castro, taking over Cuba, runs into trouble, there is nothing that can. The president will not be able to avoid committing U.S. armed forces to rescue the Enterprise. The Enterprise, again, the overthrow of Castro. Well, hello, that's what got Kennedy so angry. He didn't know about the notes, of course, but he knew he had been diddled, and that's why he said, if I had my druthers, I'd splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and cast it into the sea, okay? Now, you don't say those kinds of things, okay? And it was not only the CIA, but it was the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because it was just a year later, a little bit more, that Khrushchev put those middle-range ballistic missiles in Cuba with nuclear warheads on them. And the JCS were rubbing their hands. Now we can destroy the Soviet Union, get rid of the communist menace. And people like Dan Ellsberg asked, well, they'll retaliate. So how many million Americans will be killed? Well, we calculate just to 20 or 30 million. That's what Kennedy rushes out of the room saying, these guys are crazy. So that's what he faced up to. And they still think that he chickened out. This was an opportunity, right, to destroy not only Russia, but China. So he was facing into all this stuff. And when he ordered diminishment of 1,000 U.S. troops from Vietnam at the end of 1963, and then the bolts of the rest of them drawn out at the end of 2 years later, 1965, there, the JCS, treason, all of Southeast Asia going to go to the communists. So the JCS was just as offended, so to speak, and just as interested in getting rid of this communist-leaning president who not only made these actions, but also made the speech, which this is incredible. So that happened in August when this fellow came in and said, oh, this is terrible guy that I said to myself, well, I think that the guy to kill him if he had a chance. And then, what was that, August, September, a couple of months later, he was killed. Now, did McGovern immediately put the two, the naive, 23-year-old or something like that, the people working in the other part of the building beyond the turnstiles that I couldn't go past, to think that they would have done in the President of the United States, the fellow who invited me to come down to Washington because I thought I had something special to offer, having majored in Russian affairs and being fluent in Russian. It didn't even occur to me. But, it doesn't take long to understand what this mindset would have accommodated or thought the very sensible thing to do, to kill a guy. So I guess my point here is simply that if we finally get to resolution of this, then the situation will be different than when Donald Trump came into office. Now, Donald Trump was not supposed to win. Maybe you remember that. James Comey, the head of the FBI, when asked why he did these very illegal things to prevent Donald Trump from winning, he wrote a book and he said, we were proceeding from the premise that Hillary Clinton was a sure thing as the next president of the United States. So if that's your premise, you do all kinds of stuff to help her to win, and then you don't get indicted. My God, you don't get indicted. You get praise. You can stay in as the head of the FBI forever. Okay, so that was the feeling. The deep state did interfere, and they didn't do it right. Hillary didn't go to the right places. Hillary was not a good candidate, and Hillary lost. So the next 4 years were spent trying to emasculate Donald Trump so he couldn't possibly do anything constructive vis-a-vis Russia. Well, because you need an enemy if you're going to feed the military-industrial complex, and Russia was designated enemy then. Now we have two. We have China as well. So you have to understand that when Trump came in and it was a done deal, there was no, Hillary wasn't going to contest the election. I say that probably to her credit. So what happened? Well, very interesting. On the 3rd of January, candidate Trump, not yet president, right? Rachel Maddow invites Chuck Schumer into her program. And she says, Chuck, you said that you had something very specific and interesting to say about how Trump is lambasting the intelligence community of all places. And Chuck says, yes, Rachel, I used to think that he was a relatively stable and perspicacious fellow, a good businessman. But he's made a very serious mistake. Oh, and what would that be, Chuck? He's taken on the intelligence community. And they have 6 ways from Sunday to get back at you. So, whereas I thought he was a pretty smart guy, he's not so smart at all, what he's just done. Now, Rachel should have said, Chuck, you mean presidents should be afraid of the intelligence community? But Rachel forgot to say that. Rachel went, well, okay, we'll have the next guest. Well, there it was, folks. What were they doing? They were trying to intimidate Trump into remembering his place in the constellation of Washington. He never got the message. He did some stupid things like trusting Comey in the beginning, okay? And you know the rest of the story. So what I'm saying here is that intervention plus the deliberate Democratic deep state FBI, CIA involvement in Twitter. Remember when Biden's son Hunter's laptop story came out in the New York Post? And it was based on forensics. And who had the forensics? Not only Trump's people, but the FBI had them. So they knew what was there, okay? So what did they do? They cut the post off from Twitter and from other social media platforms. They censored the thing. And then the heads of intelligence agencies, I know some of them, okay? 51 of them concocted this message that the whole Hunter laptop thing bears all the earmarks of a Russian intelligence operation. Without a sliver of evidence. That is despicable because it played a role. I don't know if it turned the election to Biden, but it allowed Trump to get up 3 days later and say, that's a Russia disinformation operation you're quoting, Mr. Trump. And it wasn't, of course. So if you need any more evidence as to why I think the CIA needs to be confronted and why JFK, and not JFK, but Robert Kennedy Jr. is doing the right thing, well, there it is. And once again, he seemed to be in pretty good health last time I saw him on the screen. And so I just hope that enough Americans are interested in what really happened way back, 60 years plus ago, and that they'll, 60 years short ago, that they'll look into it and say, do we really want this kind of deep state tossing fear into presidents from John Kennedy down to Donald Trump, as Judge Napolitano kind of confessed or admitted and telling me that if you saw Ray, he said, of course, that Trump told him, the judge, if you saw the things I saw in those documents from the CIA and the FBI, you wouldn't have released them either. Well, who the hell is going to release them? Maybe a new president. I don't know if it would be Bobby Kennedy. Maybe a new president would have the cojones to do what a president should do.
What we're going to do, given both time and otherwise, is I'm going to combine 3 questions from 3 individuals. One is from a new person named Carl. He says he's new to this, and he simply asks, and then you'll see they're all related. How much do we actually trust Russia? This is an honest question. We all see what's happening. Is it safe to say we can somewhat trust Russia on some scale? Or is it extremely bad to trust Russia? And if so, why? That's the first one. The second is from Russ. And Russ says, even people who should know better parrot the idea that Putin is a horrible person, but they never give examples. What gives with that? And then the third comment is from Michael from Los Angeles, and he asks simply, what do you think it will take to have peace on this planet? So we should, I think, combine those three. So Harley, if you got those, trusting Russia, peace on the planet, and how come, people talk about Putin, but then don't hear it?
Well, I think the first thing you have to start with is that most people's view of Putin, of Russia, of China, of U.S. policy is dominated by what I've been calling the disinformation industrial complex. That the ability to have an honest, open discussion has been destroyed. As Ray just gave the example of what happened around the Hunter Biden laptop, what happened around Russiagate. For 4 years, we had the insistence that the Russians hacked the DNC computer when the head of the CIA at the time, Mike Pompeo, was briefed by the former technical director of the NSA, who said it's impossible that this was done as a Russian hacking. So we're subject to incredible disinformation, what's sometimes called hybrid warfare. And if you take the first two questions, how much do we trust Russia, and how come everyone thinks Putin's a horrible person? It's because we're told constantly that you can't trust Russia. I think Ray cited Clapper, who said the Russians are genetically inclined to, I don't know if he said brutality but inclined to being devious. There's a whole grouping around Chatham House and the Atlantic Council who will tell you that it's not Putin or the communists, it's the Russian national character that's the problem. And the same thing comes up around Putin, the people like Fiona Hill and the biographers of Putin, who basically make things up. So, what we have here is a situation where the disinformation industrial complex has defined the narrative. And if you object to that, you're called a Putin puppet. You might even find yourself, as Ray and I have, on a list of the Ukrainian Secret Service that says you're an information terrorist by citing obvious facts. So I think that's the problem. And this brings us to the third question, what will it take to have peace? I think there are 2 points, and I can use these as my summary for the discussion today, that will give us an opportunity. What's being raised by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on this question of the CIA presents us with an opportunity for the first time since the assassination to have an open debate and discussion and dialogue and full investigation of not just what happened in November 1963 and the cover-up afterwards, but of this process Ray and I have been discussing of the control of policy based on this idea of an enemy image and a need for a funding of a military-industrial complex. We now have an opportunity to dig into what's called the deep state, or what LaRouche used to actually call the permanent bureaucracy, especially the Justice Department and the State Department, which conducts policies that are really administrative fascism. So by raising this, as he has, courageously and personally, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. gives us an opportunity to actually discuss things that should have been discussed 60 years ago and that may play a role in turning around the United States. Now, the second point is that what's happening with the global South and the rejection of the rules-based order. At the same time of a collapse of that order, the financial system is going, the economy is going. Here in Germany, we're seeing an incredible rate of deindustrialization. The auto industry is down 10%, I think it is, or 6.5% from March to April. The business investment is down 10.7% in 1 month. So because of the crisis, the 3 of the 4 largest bank failures in U.S. history occurring, and at the same time, the discussion of a new era of economic development centered around the ideas of the Belt and Road Initiative, which come from ideas that Lyndon LaRouche discussed 50 years ago. Again, we have an opportunity for a real discussion so that the population is able to break out from under the control of the narratives. And I think that's the only way you're going to get peace. And that we have a potential for that now. That's, I guess, I'd say again, that's the bright light that's there in these times that are extremely dangerous. That as long as there are people who will fight for truth, the potential exists for a change. But it really does require not just the people like us who are talking, but the people who are listening to us to make a determination that now is the time they must act for the future.
Okay, thank you very much, Harley. Ray?
Thanks, Harley. Trust the Russians? No. In the intelligence business, you don't trust anybody. No, really. I mean, that's in international relations. You have to be pretty a hard-nosed guy and you don't trust anybody. Okay, especially, I was going to say, not even the British, but especially not the British, okay? Okay, now, what am I saying? I'm saying that I have personal experience of this kind of thing. I was chief of the Soviet foreign policy branch in the early 70s when it became clear that we had to do some kind of thing to break the arms race. We were building offensive missiles galore. We were building ABMs, anti-ballistic missiles. We're running out of money, and so is Russia, okay? Meanwhile, Nixon and Kissinger were doing a very artful dance, improving relations with China. Okay, now it's 1971, and we're seeing some flexibility in the Russian negotiating position on the strategic arms talks. Okay, I had 3 people working on that. One of them was Bobby Gates. He was with the delegation in Vienna or Helsinki, depending where it was. We had another working with the military experts and one reporting at headquarters to the muckety-mucks in Washington. I was deeply involved in this, and we said, yes, they're showing new flexibility. And so Kissinger said, now, why do you say that? Well, look what they did on Berlin. They hadn't come to a 4-power agreement on Berlin in years. And they're showing flexibility. We're going to have an agreement on Berlin. Well, how's that related? Well, we think that your overture toward China is frightening the Russians a little, and they're a little afraid that China will steal a march in relationships with you, and Russia will be at a disadvantage. Besides that, they really want to curb their defense expenditures, so they're really dealing on this anti-ballistic missile treaty. Suffice it to say, May 1972, I got to be there in Moscow during the signing, and the signing was terrific. It was the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which limited the emplacement of national anti-ballistic missiles to 2 sites and then 1 site. So neither country could think that they could do a first strike on the other without suffering massive retaliation. Okay, that was a stability that was created, and it lasted 30 years, 30 years, count them, until George W. Bush and John Bolton thought it'd be a good idea to get out of that treaty. Okay, so what am I talking about there? I'm saying that because we could see there was new flexibility, and largely because of the Chinese initiative by Nixon and Kissinger, the other thing was, okay, it looks like we have reached a pretty good arrangement on the terms. Now, McGovern, can you verify this treaty? We want to trust but only if you can verify. Okay, so we go back to the people who run the satellites and the people who collect the other information and the spies, and we say, can we verify? And they say, well, how soon do you need to know if there's a violation? So we asked Kissinger. He said, well, how about a week or 2 weeks? So we said, yeah, we can verify. Go ahead. So trust but verify. Dovere, no provere. Okay? They went ahead. Okay. 1972. Did the Russians cheat? Yes. Did we catch them? Yes. They built this god-awful monster radar in the middle of Siberia. Krasnoyarsk was the name of the place. We found it. We took photos of it. We showed the Russians, you violated the treaty, tear it down. Now, Reagan was in office then. And in those days, Schultz, his Secretary of State, would go to the Russians and say, look, we got this problem. It's a real problem. Let's sit down and talk about it. Took 6 years. Reagan was out of office, but under George H.W. Bush, Gorbachev says, all right, it's an ABM radar. We're going to tear it down. Okay, so trust but verify. That's the first point. Do I trust the Russians? No, I don't trust anybody. I'm an intelligence officer. I trust my wife. That's about it. Okay, what's the second one? Second one is, Putin's a horrible guy. You know, Harley mentioned Russiagate, Russiagate, Russiagate. It's been drummed into Americans' minds. Brainwashed is the advisable word here, that the Russians are evil, that Putin is Hitler or Stalin or just a devil incarnate. They've assimilated this, okay? That's dangerous, okay? Because it ain't true. It's not true. Now, I have people like some of my colleagues. They go on a talk show and they permit themselves to say, I detest Putin. I mean, I asked this person, why'd you have to say that? Well, he poisons people. I said, oh yeah, what's your source for that? Oh, blah, 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 blah. Even these poisonings have not been proven to the satisfaction of real intelligence analysis. It's good for propaganda. So if you begin by detesting Putin, or if you begin by saying there's no excuse, you're justifying the invasion of Ukraine. Well, let me just add a word about that. I made a big talk about 2 weeks ago for Boston Community Church and Massachusetts Peace Action. And I laid out the intermediate range and medium range ballistic missile sites that are already in Romania and already in Poland. And they were threatened to be in Ukraine itself. And I compare that to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I had charts. I did this thing like an intelligence briefing. I had the best of expertise from the physicists and the scientists and the analysts of public discourse. I put it all together. Okay. Now, one of the comments came in and they said, "Why is McGovern justifying the invasion of Ukraine?" And a very, very prominent psychiatrist wrote, I watched the thing twice, and I didn't hear McGovern say justify one time or any equivalent verb. He just laid out the facts. So it's really interesting for me, he says, that you heard McGovern's undisputed facts, and you thought that he was justifying the invasion. Oh, that's really interesting. He didn't say justify, but you apparently reasoned that those facts justify the invasion. So my message to the rest of you is don't get sidetracked on all this stuff. Even if the New York Times continues to refuse to produce the documents proving there was no Russiagate, forget about it, move on, Tell the truth and everything is going to be all right. Lastly, peace on earth. Well, I'm hoping that with new candidates in the mix, Marianne Williamson, Bobby Kennedy, Marianne Williamson. Sorry, I can't. No other name comes to mind. We have an opportunity now to get the truth out, okay? And it being just a couple of weeks short of the 60th anniversary of that American University speech, which, by the way, Khrushchev had printed in all the pages of Pravda verbatim, the whole thing, and over Radio Moscow. He thought, well, this is somebody who's human reaching out the hand to me, because the way he finished was, look, John Kennedy, look, we all breathe the same air. We all live on this same planet. And we all want the best for our children into coming generations. Don't we? I think we do, but we've got to work at it. Thanks very much, Dennis.
And thank you very much, Ray and Harley, for today's presentation and conversation. I'd like to point out to everybody that that speech is 4 weeks from today, will be June 10th. And it occurred to me, Ray, what you were saying at the end, be very good for us to probably explore that a bit more for people. Also, because the image of a president who is competent, clear, and is capable of international leadership is, I think, a very important one for Americans today. So what we're going to do in conclusion, we want to thank everybody for being with us today, and there's all sorts of things that you can do. Specifically, as everybody knows, we are involved in various congressional and related activity. You can look at, there's also a mass leaflet that we've just released earlier this week on this question of the danger of war. And you can get in touch with us if you would be interested in helping us distribute that. I suspect that there may be an official statement from us or a general response to these recent words of Robert Kennedy Jr., just as an organization. I believe we're going to try to get that out in mass distribution as well. So all of those things would be matters that you may wish to communicate with us on and get involved with, and also publications and various of the pamphlets and other literature that we distribute. But what we're going to do today, just in conclusion, just to give you a taste of this, and you can perhaps go to the internet yourself if you're interested in seeing the entire speech, we're going to conclude with an excerpt from Kennedy's American University speech of June 4th, June 10th, 1963.
I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth, peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. So let us persevere. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Among the many traits the peoples of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other, and no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.